My sister stood at the panel table in a pressed, charcoal blazer, and told the CPA Ontario Discipline Committee that I had fabricated my professional accounting designation from the very beginning. She said it without once looking in my direction. My mother sat 3 rows behind her in the public gallery, hands clasped in her lap, her expression arranged into the careful posture of a woman doing something painful out of love. They had coordinated their outfits. They both wore navy. I sat at the respondent's table. My hands were flat on the surface. I said nothing. The panel chair, a woman who had served on the CPA Ontario Discipline Committee for nearly 18 years, opened the complaint file and moved through the first 2 exhibits with a steady professional pace. Then she reached the third. She stopped reading. She tilted the documents at Swainji's. She read it again slowly, the way you read something when you already understand that something is very wrong, but your brain is still catching up to what your eyes are seeing. She set the page down. She leaned toward the panel clerk and spoke to him in a voice too low for anyone else in the room to hear. Then she stood up, excused herself from the table, and left the hearing room without addressing anyone. My sister sat back slightly in her chair. She reached under the table and touched my brother-in-law's wrist. She thought the recess was a good sign for her side. She didn't understand what she had just put in front of that panel. She didn't understand that the whole structure had already begun to come down. The formal complaint letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late February. I was at my desk on King Street West, working through a stack of T4 slips before the CRA filing deadline, when my assistant came into the office and set a certified envelope on top of my keyboard. The return address was CPA Ontario's Professional Conduct Department. I signed for it. She left me alone. I had been a chartered professional accountant for 9 years. I had opened my own firm 6 years ago. I had never received a letter from Professional Conduct in my career. Inside was a 12-page formal complaint. My sister's name was printed at the top as primary complainant. The allegation was that I had misrepresented my academic credentials during the CPA certification process, submitted falsified documentation to obtain my designation, and had been practicing under a professional title I had not legitimately earned. Attached were 2 sworn supporting statements, one from my mother, one from my brother-in-law. I read the document straight through once without stopping. Then I read it again. I noticed that my hands were not shaking. I found that slightly strange, because my designation was the thing I had built everything else on top of, and the document in my hands was asking a regulatory body to take it away from me permanently. My hands should have been shaking. Instead, they were entirely still. I think that stillness was the first sign that something in me had already shifted from shock into something colder and far more useful. I put my coat on, I got in my car and drove to Oakville. My mother's driveway had been freshly shoveled. My sister's Lexus was already parked outside the garage, which meant either she had known I was coming, or she had been waiting there specifically for this moment. My mother answered the door before I finished knocking. She was standing with her shoulders squared, and her chin at the angle she uses when she has already decided she is right and has no interest in being redirected. I walked past her into the kitchen. I set the complaint letter on the counter and smoothed it flat with my palm. She looked at it the way you look at something you were expecting to see. She said she was sorry I was upset, but this had not been an easy decision, and it had come from a place of genuine concern. She said, my sister and my brother-in-law had brought her serious information and she could not simply pretend they hadn't. She said the stress of my father's estate had been hard on all of them, and that she was worried I wasn't managing well. Her voice had the soft, careful quality she uses when she has rehearsed what she is going to say and is monitoring her own delivery. My sister was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea in front of her. She had the composed expression on, the one she defaults to when she wants to appear as the calm, reasonable party in the room. She said what they were doing was because they cared about me. She said she hoped I could see that eventually. Her voice was even and kind, in a way that felt assembled rather than felt. I stood in that kitchen for perhaps 30 seconds. I looked at the 2 of them. Then I picked up the complaint letter off the counter, folded it back into my coat pocket, and walked out. The drive back into the city took 45 minutes in early evening traffic. I spent most of it being very precise with myself about what I had just witnessed. My sister was not impulsive in the way that produces formal regulatory complaints. That kind of complaint requires legal guidance. Someone explaining the process, coaching the language, making the documentation look credible enough to survive an initial review. My brother-in-law had built a development company from scratch. He understood institutions and how to navigate them. He had a structural reason for wanting me professionally discredited. I just didn't know yet what it was. I called a friend from my articling days, who now ran a forensic accounting practice in Scarborough. She was someone I trusted completely, and someone who knew how to keep her findings to herself until the right moment. I asked her to quietly review the financial records of our family's holding company going back 3 years. My father had incorporated the company 15 years before he died. He had listed me as the CPI of record and signing officer on the financial statements, and he had given my brother-in-law operational control over the development side. When my father died 2 years ago, that arrangement continued under my mother's nominal oversight. My brother-in-law had been managing the day-to-day, without any meaningful scrutiny. My friend came back to me in 5 days. She sat across from me in my client chair, with a printed summary on her knees and a careful expression on her face, and she said she needed me to understand something clearly before she walked me through it. She said what she had found was not accidental. This was not careless bookkeeping. This was constructed, deliberately and over time. Over 28 months, my brother-in-law had been processing payments to a vendor, registered under a numbered company in Brampton. The numbered company's registered address was a postal box at a shipping outlet. It had no operating history, no verifiable employees, and no record of ever performing any services for the holding company. But it had received $296,000 in payments. All of them processed through invoices he had generated using an administrative login that predated the access controls I had implemented after my father's estate was settled. The CRA had sent a compliance review notice to the holding company's registered address 6 weeks earlier. My brother-in-law had intercepted it. He had not forwarded it to me, as he was required to do under the operating agreement. He had simply kept it and said nothing. The sequence clicked into place with a clarity that made my chest go cold. If I lost my CPA designation before the CRA examiner arrived, if a disciplinary panel had already found that my certification was fraudulent, he could argue to the auditors that every financial statement I had signed for the company was potentially tainted. He could reframe himself as a victim of my professional misconduct. He could redirect scrutiny away from the vendor payments and toward the integrity of the records as a whole, records that bore my signature. He needed me professionally destroyed before the CRA walked through the door. My friend put the summary on the desk and waited. I asked her if she could format everything as evidentiary documentation. She said she had already done so. I asked if she would testify if it came to that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said yes, without qualification. I thanked her. I told her to stay available. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning the lights on, and then I turned them on and started working. I pulled the original physical file from my fireproof cabinet. I had kept the complete registration record since the day I received my designation, original university transcripts, examination results, practical experience verification letters, every supporting document from the initial CPA application. Everything was original. Every date was verifiable. Every page bore the authentic marks of the issuing institution. My lawyer reviewed the complaint documents alongside my originals and flagged the problem within 20 minutes. The transcript my sister and brother-in-law had submitted as Exhibit C, the one they claimed demonstrated credential irregularities, bore my university's letterhead and crest, but the grade notation system used in the document had not been adopted by the University Registrar's Office until a system redesign in 2019. My degree was conferred in 2009. I had obtained my original transcript in 2009 under the old system. Anyone familiar with the university's records administration, anyone who had actually handled a 2009 transcript, would have recognized the difference immediately. They had forged the document they used to accuse me of forgery. My lawyer requested a formal written confirmation from the University Registrar's Office detailing the notation standards in use in 2009. It arrived by courier in 3 business days. She also obtained a certified statement from CPA Ontario's own registration department, confirming that my original application file showed no irregularities at the time of submission, or in any subsequent review. And then there was the digital record my mother had inadvertently created. In the weeks before the complaint was filed, my brother-in-law had sent my sister a series of messages about their approach. My sister had forwarded some of those messages to our mother. My mother had then forwarded 3 of them from her tablet to her own email account. Perhaps to save them, perhaps simply out of habit. She had done this while connected to her home Wi-Fi. The metadata embedded in each forwarded message recorded the device identifier, the send timestamp, and the originating IP address. The IP address belonged to my mother's router in Oakville. She had not been a reluctant bystander who signed a supporting statement under pressure. She had been an active and informed participant in the planning, communicating about strategy in real time, on her own device, from her own home. They had operated as though my devastation was guaranteed, and my silence was assured. There is a memory I have carried for a long time. I was 23 years old, sitting in my parents' kitchen with a formal offer letter in my hand from one of the largest mid-sized accounting firms in Toronto. My first position out of the CPA program, with a starting salary that was more than either of my parents had earned in any single year of my childhood. I had worked 2 part-time jobs to cover my tuition, without asking anyone for help, and I had finally made it, and I wanted them to know that. My father took the letter. He read it. He asked, in a tone of genuine curiosity, whether I had considered what would happen if the firm reorganized within the first 18 months, since accounting was a volatile field, and entry-level positions were rarely stable. He set the letter back on the table with the careful gesture of someone returning something unremarkable. My mother said it was a good start and asked if I wanted tea. My sister didn't look up. She had received a smaller offer from a regional firm the month before, and my parents had hosted a dinner for her with guests. I took the letter home that night and framed it. It hangs on the wall of my office on King Street West, directly across from the client chair, where I see it every time I look up from my desks. I thought about that kitchen table for a long time in the weeks before the hearing. They had never believed I would build something substantial. What they had never calculated was that spending years in a house where your achievements are quietly minimized, and your evidence is never quite enough teaches you, eventually, to document everything. Every receipt, every original, every date stamp, every forwarded email sitting in a metadata trail that anyone with the right tools can read like a map. The gutter, they assumed, would reduce me. They forgot that the people the gutter does not break learn very quickly how to read the terrain. The panel chair returned to the hearing room after 11 minutes. She came back with a quality of stillness around her that had not been there when she left. She asked my sister's counsel whether the complainant was prepared to speak to the provenance and authentication of Exhibit C. My sister's counsel requested a brief adjournment to confer with his client. The request was denied. The committee had scheduled a full-day hearing, and the documentation in question had been available for review since the date the complaint was filed. My lawyer rose from her chair. She placed our response package on the panel table and walked the committee through each document in order. She was unhurried. She did not raise her voice. She presented the university registrar's written confirmation regarding 2009 notation standards and invited the committee to compare it directly against Exhibit C. She presented the forensic accounting report and walked through the shell company payment timeline in detail. She presented the digital metadata record from my mother's message forwarding and noted the timestamps and device identifiers. She concluded by noting that the CRA compliance review notice had been withheld from me, the CPA of record, for 6 weeks, and that this fact had now been reported to the CRA's enforcement division directly. My brother-in-law was gripping the edge of the table. I could see it from across the room. The composed, faintly bored effect he had maintained since the hearing opened had buckled completely. He looked like a man who had been absolutely certain, until approximately 20 minutes ago, that a particular door was locked, and had just heard someone on the other side turn the handle. My sister looked at him. He did not look back at her. She tried one last time. She said that regardless of whatever financial matters may have been occurring separately, the original complaint about my credentials had been filed in good faith, based on information she had been given and believed to be true. Her voice had lost all the careful rehearsal it had carried at the start of the morning. It sounded thinner, more honest, actually. But honesty delivered 12 minutes too late does not reset a record. The panel chair said she understood my sister's position. She also noted for the official record that the committee was referring Exhibit C to the Professional Conduct Investigation Unit for formal examination, not in relation to my conduct, but in relation to the conduct of the complainants. She said all parties would be contacted regarding next steps. She closed the session. My mother stood up in the gallery before the panel chair had finished speaking. Her voice carried across the room. She said there had been a significant misunderstanding that she needed to clarify. A staff member walked over and asked her quietly to wait in her seat until the room had cleared. I picked up my coat. I did not look at my sister or my brother-in-law as I walked out. The criminal referral came through 8 days after the hearing. My brother-in-law retained criminal defense counsel by the end of that week. The CRA compliance review had commenced the morning after the hearing was closed, expedited by the forensic accounting report that had been submitted through the appropriate channels. The examining officer arrived at the holding company's registered office with a production order covering 6 years of financial records. My mother posted a portion of her RRSP toward the initial bail amount. I found out about it through my aunt, who called me on a Sunday evening. My mother did not call me herself. I don't know what she would have said if she had. My sister left 2 voicemails in the weeks that followed. The first was 11 minutes of explanation about how she had been misled by her husband, and had not understood the full scope of what she was participating in. The second was a request, which shifted in tone about halfway through into something closer to an instruction, that I provide a written statement to the CRA examiner, confirming she had no direct knowledge of the vendor payment scheme. Her voice was unsteady across both messages. I listened to them in full, then I deleted them. My brother-in-law was ultimately charged with fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and tax evasion. The charges carried potential sentences, that his defense counsel would spend the better part of the following year attempting to negotiate into something more manageable. My mother's posted bail funds were assessed as part of a civil recovery action some months later. The holding company went into receivership. The formal dismissal letter from CPA Ontario arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. I read it once at my desk over my lunch break, filed it in the original cabinet, and went back to the client work I had been doing before the mail came. People ask me sometimes how I sat at that respondent's table without flinching. They ask how I walked straight from that hearing back to my office. They ask how I listened to my sister's voicemails all the way through and did not call her back. I want to be honest about it, because the honest version is the one that might actually be useful to you. I did not feel nothing. I felt an enormous amount, for a long time, mostly alone, mostly late at night, in the months before and after the hearing. What I had built over 9 years, through every course, every exam sitting, every early morning in that office before my assistant arrived, was not just a designation. It was the proof of a premise. That I could build something real without their belief in me, and without their money and without their approval. When the complaint arrived, what was being threatened was not just my license. It was the proof itself. That is not a small thing to sit with quietly. It took everything I had. But feelings and decisions are not the same event. You can feel something completely and still choose, with full clarity, what comes next. That separation is a skill. It cost me years to develop it, and I think it saved everything that mattered. There are 3 things I have come to understand that I want to leave with you. The first, the idea that shared blood creates an obligation of unlimited tolerance is a story that benefits almost exclusively the people who are consistently asking you to tolerate something. My family used the language of love and concern as a delivery mechanism for control. When my professional standing threatened to expose something they needed concealed, that performance of concern became a legal instrument filed with a regulatory body. Unconditional family loyalty is not a natural law. It is a social contract, and like any contract, its terms matter. You are allowed to read the terms. You are allowed to refuse them. Biology does not earn a person the right to dismantle what you have spent your life building. The second, in every family built around a dominant story, there is usually someone whose role is to make the rest of the story cohere by contrast. That person is positioned as the difficult one, the overly serious one, the one who doesn't appreciate what they've been given. My independence was called selfishness. My precision was called rigidity. My ambition was called compensation for something unnamed. These were not observations about who I was. They were management strategies. The moment I understood that, I stopped needing them to be wrong. I just needed to document them accurately. The third, and the one I come back to most, stillness is not the same as surrender. When I sat at that table with my hands flat and my breathing even, and the panel chair walking out of the room with a page tilted in her hands, I was not holding something back. I was not managing collapse behind a composed face. I was at rest, entirely, because I had already done the work. I knew what was in the folder. I knew what was coming. The panic in that room belonged to the people who had built everything on the assumption that I would be too devastated to look clearly. The most disorienting thing you can ever do to someone who is counting on your collapse is to simply not collapse. Document everything, stay quiet, get your receipts in order. My practice is still on King Street West. I walk up from Union Station on cold mornings past the same coffee shop I have stopped at for 6 years, and I think briefly about the kitchen table in Oakville, where my father set my offer letter down without ceremony, and about how far this office is from that table, and then the light changes at the corner, and I go upstairs, and I get back to work. The question worth sitting with right now, not scrolling past, actually sitting with, is this: whose version of you are you still living inside? And is it a version you chose?